Right now, we're going to transition to a presentation from Dr. Rebecca Campbell from Michigan State University. Dr. Campbell could not actually join us today. She had a complication, so she graciously pre-recorded her presentation earlier this week for us. So we're going to go ahead and play that back.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Campbell, and I'm a professor of psychology at Michigan State University. And thanks for coming to my presentation today on how sexual assault kit testing could prevent future crimes. This is research that was supported by a grant from the National Institute of Justice, and the opinions in today's talk are those of the author and do not reflect the official position of any participating organization or the U.S. Department of Justice. I do want to thank my colleagues who collaborated on this project, Dr. Stephen Pierce, Dr. Rachel Goodman-Williams, and Dr. Hannah Feeney. And I thank my colleagues at RTI's National Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Training and Technical Assistance Project for their helpful feedback on this project. So let's start off with a little bit of background about the issue of untested kits. So why should we submit those unsubmitted kits, the ones that the police did not submit to a crime lab and the ones that are in storage? As more and more jurisdictions across the US are finding these older unsubmitted kits, why should we submit them? Well, the literature has identified many different reasons why we should be submitting those older unsubmitted kits. First and foremost, they can be really helpful for identifying perpetrators of sexual assaults, particularly in stranger sexual assault, where the victim doesn't know who assaulted them. Obviously, SAK testing and DNA testing can be helpful for confirming the identity in non-stranger sexual assaults. So in that case, the survivor does know who assaulted them, but still a DNA test, a CODIS hit, a CODIS match would be really instrumental in confirming that. We also see from current research that SAK testing can be really powerful in revealing potential serial offenders through DNA matches. So that's the situation where the DNA in a sexual assault kit gets to a reference sample in CODIS, which matches to another sexual assault and maybe another sexual assault case and another sexual assault case and the like. So revealing serial offenders through DNA matches across cases. SAK testing evidence can be instrumental if a case goes to trial in corroborating witnesses, and it can also be really instrumental in exonerating individuals who've been wrongly accused of committing a crime they didn't do. Testing kits is also instrumental for survivors healing and giving them some closure for the trauma that they've experienced. In addition, we're also seeing growing evidence that it's important to test kits and to upload all lawfully owed DNA samples and all eligible forensic samples to CODIS so that we're populating CODIS, so that CODIS continues to have as many forensic samples as possible. The more that we put into CODIS, the more that CODIS can be helpful as a tool for investigators and prosecutors. And then finally, there's some growing discussion in the academic research literature that testing these older kits could be instrumental in preventing future crimes. And that is what I want to focus on today, is really trying to understand what is the value of testing these older kits and potentially preventing future crimes. So how then could testing a rape kit prevent other crimes from happening? Well, let's walk through the logic together. Well, if you take that kit and you submit it to a forensic crime laboratory, they may be able to extract a DNA sample. Depending upon whether that sample meets all of the requirements for the FBI's upload to CODIS, that sample may be uploaded to the forensic index of CODIS. It could then match to a suspect, either through a hit to the offender index or through another forensic association that could be figured out in the process of conducting an investigation. Depending upon how that investigation pans out, it may be the case that a case is referred to prosecutors for consideration of charges. And if so, maybe a case would go to trial or to a plea bargain where we can secure a conviction. Based on that, maybe there would be incarceration or other type of education or rehabilitation for the offender, all of which leading to the possibility that the offender is unable or unwilling to commit more crimes. So the logic is there. Absolutely, the logic is there. And as I was walking through this, all of you heard each one of the asterisks in my voice. Each one of those things has a big if. So we extract a DNA sample if there is one. We would upload it to CODIS if it's eligible. It would identify the suspect if there's a CODIS hit. There would be an investigation if the police do the investigation. It would go to the prosecutors if they take the case and are able to secure a conviction. An offender would be incarcerated if the judge and jury do so, and future crimes would be prevented if the offender decides to not commit any additional offenses. So obviously, this is conditional. This is not an absolute. There's a lot of if and possibilities and hypotheticals here, and we don't know what might happen in the future. But it's possible. It's possible. And that's what we wanted to do in this study, was to develop empirically based estimates of the number and the types of crimes that might be prevented if we start testing previously unsubmitted sexual assault kits and start keeping current with all of our current case SAKs too. So with that background, let's talk a little bit about the current study and how we tried to develop those estimates of what could be prevented through SAK testing. So by way of overview, here's the logic that we followed in our methods. So we worked with a community, Detroit, Michigan, that had large numbers of previously unsubmitted kits. And we drew a very large sample, roughly 7,300 of those kits that had not been submitted to the lab initially. We had all of them outsourced to a lab for forensic DNA testing. And our local colleagues at the Michigan State Police did all of the appropriate quality control checks. And then from that testing, the samples that were eligible for upload to CODIS were uploaded. And then we counted how many CODIS hits came from that sample. And specifically, how many were CODIS suspect hits, meaning that the sample hit to a reference sample in the offender index. Because then once we had the offender, a suspect identification, the next step was to obtain the criminal history records for those offenders. So CODIS gave us a promising investigational lead. So then we could use that information to obtain the criminal history records for those offenders. And then once we had the criminal history records of those offenders for the time that they were age 16 and up in the state of Michigan, our research team could then timeline the number and types of crimes that appeared in their criminal history records. And then we could model the number and types of preventable crimes. So more specifically, as I said, we started with a sample of roughly 7,287 previously unsubmitted kits. From that testing, there were 1,270 unique and identifiable offenders, meaning that it was an offender CODIS hit. So that list of 1,270 went over to the Criminal History Records Division. And from that, they did a search of their Michigan criminal history records since age 16. Of that 1,270, 1,142 had a criminal history record. And then we narrowed it just a little bit further down to our final sample size of 1,082 offenders who had a record, and we could confirm the exact date that previously unsubmitted kit was collected. And let me show you now why we need that other detail, why that's really important. Okay, so we got de-identified data. We don't know these offenders' names. We don't have a state ID number. We certainly don't have their DNA. What we have is an ID number. So we have ID number 001 all the way up to ID number 1082. And what we have is a long series of data fields that tells us the date and the criminal code of what cases are in their criminal history records. So then based on that, we can fill in from those codes, what were the specific crimes for which they were arrested, charged, or convicted, excuse me. And then so we can timeline that out. So looking at offender number 1, it's like, okay, well, we know since age 16, they had a larceny, they had a weapons charge, they had an assault, they had a sexual assault, they had a homicide, and they had a sexual assault. We can repeat that for every single person all the way down to 1,082 who had an assault, a domestic violence, a sexual assault, a weapons, a domestic assault, and a sexual assault. So we have everything from the age of 16 to the current day, the exact date of the offense and the type of the offense. So then the question becomes, So when in this timeline was that unsubmitted kit? When did that happen? Because remember, an unsubmitted kit is a case where a survivor went to a hospital emergency department. They had a medical forensic exam. They consented to that evidence being collected in a kit. They released the kit to law enforcement for forensic DNA testing, and they filed a police report. But the police did not submit the kit for testing. And in these cases, they did not follow up more often than not on these reported sexual assaults. So what I want to know as a researcher is, when in that timeline was that unsubmitted kit? When did that fall? Like, for example, if it fell right there where the arrow is pointing, that would make me look at that sexual assault that came afterwards a little differently. Because had the police taken action at that time, maybe that other sexual assault wouldn't have happened. So that additional sexual assault goes into our list of a potentially preventable crime. But what if the unsubmitted kit occurred here? So look at where the arrow is now on the slide. Does that make you look a little different at both that homicide and that sexual assault? So had the police taken action, had there been a CODIS hit at that time, could that homicide and that sexual assault have been prevented? Again, we don't know, but what we can do is start to model the potential preventable crimes. What if that kit happened all the way back there? Then it might make us look differently at the weapons, the assault, the sexual assault, the homicide, and the sexual assault differently. So that's what I mean when we're talking about different ranges of estimates. So depending on exactly when that kit happened in each offender's timeline, we would have a different count of the number and the type of crimes that were conceivably preventable. So that takes each person's criminal history record, and it gives us a chance, based on the date of the unsubmitted kit, to draw a line before and after. So the criminal incidents that happened before the unsubmitted kit and after the unsubmitted kit. And the stuff that comes after the unsubmitted kit is a potential preventable crime. Now, that said, everybody who's logged on to this presentation says, whoa, wait a minute. You gotta give the lab time to test the kit. Absolutely. So we need to build that into our estimates too. So once a kit had been collected, and if it had been submitted, then there's a period of time where the lab needs to test it. And in all fairness, the police can't act on testing results that they don't have. So we need to build in what we've referred to as the testing window. So a period of time where it wouldn't be possible for the evidence to inform an investigation because it's still at the lab. So then the question becomes, how much time do we give for the testing window? Well, I trust that folks on this call also would be mindful that that could be from the start of the testing window, is the date that an unsubmitted kit was collected at the medical facility, and the duration could go all the way through when the kit is ultimately tested. And as all of you are very definitely aware, I'm sure, more and more states are passing legislation that is mandating the length of that testing window. No longer discretionary, no longer, based on what, the lab can or can't do. They're legislatively mandating. Once a kit has been collected at a hospital, there's a discrete period of time that law enforcement have to pick it up, get it to the lab, and for the lab to test it and to report out the results. And in our state, we do have a law to this effect. It's the Michigan Sexual Assault Evidence Submission Act. And it stipulates that there's 118 days from the time that a kit is collected and released by the victim to law enforcement to the time when the law enforcement collects the kit, submits it to the lab, and the lab completes the testing. We can have a different debate about whether 118 days is realistic. That's a fair question and a fair debate, but it is what is legislatively mandated here in Michigan. So what that does for me as a researcher is it gives me a clear way to operationalize the length of the testing window. So if the testing had been completed in 118 days, then we can define a clear after period. And so that's what we did. So for each and every offender in our data set, all 1,082, we looked at the exact date the kit was collected. We measured 118 days after that and we define for them what was the start of their after period. So it depends person by person, depending upon when that unsubmitted kit was collected, when the offense happened, essentially. So for number one, it might be here. For person number two, it might be here, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. So this is, a lot more data coding work, but it's important because what we don't want to do is start counting things in the after window, again, when there was no opportunity for the police to even have that information because it was still at the lab being tested. So for each and every offender, we have statistical code that starts what is their after window. And so we know for each specific one, what were the offenses that fell in the after window, because those are the ones that are potentially preventable. So again, as you can see here in this hypothetical example, for person number one, that homicide and that sexual assault, that came after the kit had been collected and after it could have been tested. And so we look at those two crimes as potentially preventable crimes. And then going all the way down to our last hypothetical example there for person 1082, depending upon the start of their after window, we look at that sexual assault, the weapons charge, the domestic assault, and the sexual assault as potentially preventable crimes. So with that coding, then what we wanted to do analytically was get some numbers regarding the overall number of crimes that happened in these offenders after windows, and the number of crimes by type. How many different types of crimes of each type, sexual crimes, violent crimes, property crimes, other crimes, was happening in that after window. So let's start now by looking at the overall number of crimes that we found that occurred in the after window. On average, in our study, these 1,082 offenders were linked to 5.5 separate criminal offenses after the SAK could have been feasibly tested. The range was 1 criminal incident to 49 separate criminal incidents. So we had some very, very prolific offenders there. We also did some additional modeling, and I'm happy to send those results to anyone who might be interested, to look at the rate of offending for these offenders over time. And to our concern, what we found was that their rate of offending was statistically increasing over time. Over the course of the after SAK testing window, the rate of offending is increasing. They are doing more criminal behavior, and specifically, they're doing more sexual crimes and more violent crimes. So specifically, the rate of sexual and violent crimes is increasing faster than for other types of crimes, such as property crimes, in the after testing window. So after a kit could have been tested, they are continuing to offend, and the nature of their criminal activity is becoming more frequent for sexual and violent crimes. So let's take a closer look at that now by looking at the number of crimes and the type of crimes that are happening in the after period. So let's start with the sex crimes. So what you see in this chart here, represented in the rows, are the two specific codes or types of criminal offenses that we looked at in this study. So we looked at how many criminal sexual conduct offenses there were, which in the state of Michigan is our criminal statute for sexual assault, and then other sex crimes, which would include things like the peeping toms, the voyeuristic, the exhibitionist sex crimes. So that's what's represented in the rows. The columns represent the first one in light gray, shows you the number of offenders linked by DNA to a criminal incident of that type in the after testing window. So what this tells us is that we had 207 offenders who were linked to another sexual assault after the focal kit could have been tested. How many incidents were they linked to? 320. That's the next column over. So that's the total number of criminal incidents by type after the testing window. And you're like, wait a minute. Those numbers don't match. I know they don't match. That's the problem. We have 207 people linked to 320 separate sexual assaults. What does that mean? Some of those 207 offenders committed additional sexual assaults, not just one in their after window, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 additional sexual assaults. So 207 offenders linked to 320 additional sexual assaults that came after the focal kit could have been tested per those legislative mandates. With respect to other sexual crimes, not quite as frequent, only 74 offenders were linked to other types of sex crimes, 92 incidents of that type. Again, telling us that those 74 people some of them are doing it more than once. So now let's take a look at other crimes, violent crimes, non-sexual violent crimes. So again, the rows represent the types of crimes. So we have assault, domestic violence, assault, non-domestic violence, homicides, robberies, and weapons. And again, column 1, the first one represents how many people. So we had 246 of these offenders were linked to a domestic violence assault after their SAK could have been tested. And again, some of them are doing it more than once because there were 388 separate DV incidents after the rape kit could have been tested. For non-domestic violence assault, we had 525 offenders who had had that kind of assault in their criminal history record, specifically 1,047. So definitely many of them doing this more than once. Very disturbing and unexpected finding, at least to us as researchers, maybe not to our colleagues in law enforcement. 74 offenders were linked to a homicide after the rape kit was not tested, and specifically 86 separate homicides. So some of those offenders were linked to more than one homicide after the kit could have been tested. We had 328 people associated with a robbery, 331 episodes of robbery, 386 people with a felony weapons, 565. So quite a bit of violent non-sexual crimes. Turning to property crimes, again, the rate here was not as increasing as fast as it was for the violent crimes and the sex crimes, but we are still seeing a fair number of crimes. Arson, not particularly, only 19 offenders linked to 20 incidents. 210 of these offenders were linked to a burglary incident, 379 burglary incidents to be specific, and 420 had a subsequent larceny, theft, or fraud charge, specifically over 1,000 separate incidents. And then finally, we did look at other types of crimes, such as drug offenses or traffic or ordinance offenses, as those might be other instances where they do come into contact with members of the criminal justice system. As you might expect, those were considerably higher. We had 428 offenders who had a drug crime after the rape kit could have been tested, 950 separate drug-related crimes, and 670 were involved in some type of traffic or ordinance violation after the rape kit could have been tested, for a total of over 2,000 incidents of that type. So I do have some additional analyses that I'd be happy to share with interested folks that takes those numbers and breaks them down a little bit more refined, depending on when an offender's reference sample might have been loaded to CODIS and the exact time when in the after window the hit might have occurred, giving us lower and upper bound estimates of our potentially preventable crimes. But for today, we're going to keep it simple, and let's move on to talking about what are some of the implications of these findings. So key finding number 1, there was a substantial number of sexual and violent crimes that were committed by these offenders after these kits could have been tested. It was a missed opportunity. We had a window of opportunity to test, to potentially identify, to arrest, to apprehend. It didn't happen. So the offenders did go on to commit additional crimes. And indeed, our modeling suggests that they actually increase that over time, and that the rate of sexual and violent crimes is increasing over time. We saw a substantial number of sexual assaults, domestic violence assaults, other assaults, and homicides. 86 homicides were linked to offenders in the sample. All of them happened after that SAK could have been tested. So this also tells us that we see a great deal of crossover offending. These are not folks who do one type of crime. Some of them go on to commit other sexual assaults, but some of them go on to commit other types of crimes. There's tremendous crossover offending. And we are starting to see this more and more as these untested kits are submitted and are tested, that we're seeing that the type of crimes associated with these offenders runs the gamut of other types of sex crimes, violent crimes, property crimes, drug offenses, and other types of things. So for our colleagues in law enforcement, that means that today you might be seeing them for one type of crime, but tomorrow it could be a very different type of crime. So what do these findings suggest in terms of testing policies and protocols? It does provide strong empirical support for mandatory testing legislation. It's important to get these kits tested, that this should not be a discretionary decision by members of the criminal justice system. If a victim is released this, there is tremendous potential utility to the criminal justice system and to public safety to having these kits tested. We modeled a testing window of 118 days based on the mandates in our legislation. But again, we invite other research teams to try other types of testing windows and looking at different modeling to see what might be feasible for labs and what might be trade-offs of different types of testing, different lengths, of testing windows, for us to get a feel for what is the potential value of testing these kits and how quickly do we need to do this. Because our data suggests that time does matter, and it particularly matters for preventing other sexual assaults and violent crimes. These results also tell us the importance of getting those reference samples uploaded to CODIS, getting them collected from arrestees and convicted felons as part of lawfully owed DNA programs, getting those samples into CODIS. That depending upon when the reference sample hits and when that match happens, it diminishes the potential for other potentially preventable crimes. For our colleagues in investigation and prosecution, it tells us that timely action based on those results is critical. These offenders do go on to commit additional crimes. DNA is only one type of evidence, so there may be other types of evidence. And as our colleagues in law enforcement often say, work the case, use all available evidence, DNA evidence and other types of evidence to see what is possible to try to do something about these reported sexual assaults. And then finally, for our colleagues in advocacy, one of the key reasons why survivors report to the criminal justice system, in fact, it's the #1 reason, it comes out in study after study after study, is they don't want somebody else to experience what they experienced. They report to prevent others from being harmed. Survivors feel anger, betrayal, and guilt when they reach out and they try to have something done and they're not believed, kits aren't tested, and then they find out that somebody else was harmed. So we need to act on the information that they provide, and we need to provide survivors with faith and trust in the criminal justice system, that when they have a kit collected, it will be tested. When they report to police, they will be treated with dignity and respect. The case will be investigated, and then depending on all available facts in the case, that a case may go forward for consideration for charges. So I thank you all for coming to my presentation. Here is my contact information, and I invite any and all of you to reach out if you'd like to talk more about this. And if you would like to see the additional modeling that we did, looking at the range of estimates, high and low, on what are potentially preventable crimes based on SAK testing. Thank you so much.